always get my best clothes muddy.
He lightly shook his head, never breaking his gaze from the space behind me or letting his smile fall. I stayed silent for a moment as I stroked his hair, unsure of what else to ask without being so blunt and upsetting him. His wide green eyes suddenly darted back to mine.
When I was 7, they took me to a real live symphony,
he said, sounding oddly proud, and still smiling wistfully. I smiled back at him widely, just enjoying his happiness, despite the sore subject. He smiled wider at me as he twirled my hair.
Have you ever gone to anything like that?
He asked with a curious expression. I smiled, and shook my head remorsefully. He smiled sweetly at me as he fingered my hair.
We'll go to one together one day,
he promised softly. And the thought of Edward making plans for us like that made me downright giddy, so I kept my smile in place. But the truth that was staring me in the face was heartbreaking. Edward didn't force himself to forget his childhood because it was bad. He forced himself to forget it because it was happy. There were probably plenty of reasons why. Maybe he thought he didn't deserve the good memories, or maybe they just made him bitter because that life was unattainable. Either way, he pushed them back and put that one awful event into the spotlight as his very first defining moment. I didn't want to ruin his wistfully happy mood, but my love for him only fueled my curiosity about that one particular event. We continued smiling at each other as I stroked his hair and he twirled mine against my back. What happened when you were 9? I whispered to him quietly, attempting to be vague by using his age as a reference. His wistful smile slowly fell, as the same pain flashed in his eyes as before. He didn't close his eyes this time, and I was quite privy to viewing his torment, as he began to speak again.
It was their anniversary,
he whispered sadly, twirling my hair faster around his finger, while I continued stroking his in an attempt to offer some comfort. His tone and comment made it clear to me that he knew exactly what I wanted to know. And he was giving it.
May 13th.
He clarified while his agonized eyes gazed into mine. I nodded in encouragement against my palm on the pillow. He twirled my hair faster around his finger as his eyes grew impossibly more pained.
My dad and I planned a big night for her,
he choked in a voice so thick with tears it made my own heart clench. I was seriously considering stopping them, as the anguish possessed his features so completely that my chest hurt just watching it. He was twirling my lock of hair desperately, almost pulling it, as it slid around his finger furiously. His lightly stubbled jaw quivered slightly as his tortured green eyes brimmed with moisture.
I thought that candles were romantic,
he whispered in an excruciated tone. And as I watched the tears finally spill over his cheeks, and onto the pillow below his head, I decided that I knew quite enough. I swiftly lifted my head up from my palm, and plunged my face into the crook of his neck, trying to hug him despite the awkward position. He seemed to understand as he tightened his arms around my waist, and buried his face into my shoulder. I wiggled my free hand underneath his neck, to get a better grip as I hugged his head to me tighter. I still didn't have any exact details about how the fire started. The little ones that would indicate if he actually blamed himself for the whole thing, and not just for being too scared to get help for his father. It would make so much more sense to me, all that self-hatred and disgust. And I feared that if he did have something to do with the fire, he would never forgive himself. It would always haunt him. The same way I'm haunted that I couldn't scream earlier, or run faster, or be stronger to save my mother. We were so similar, and yet worlds apart. I held him lovingly for what felt like hours, occasionally kissing his neck softly as he held me firmly against him, willing him to let me take some of his burden. He was completely silent as I stroked his hair. And even though he wasn't sobbing or breathing any differently, I could feel his tears through my red cotton shirt for a long while. Just as I was considering humming him to sleep, and hoping that he would forgive me for taking advantage of him at such a vulnerable moment, he turned his face into my neck, and planted a small kiss on it. He let out a deep breath against my skin, caressing my neck in moist warmth.
Let's get the fuck out of here tomorrow,
He mumbled against me, squeezing me tighter against him as I furrowed my brows in confusion at his request.
Just you and me, away from all this bullshit.
He pleaded desperately, back to his normal Edward voice, expletives and all. I smiled against his neck and nodded in agreement. We had been under an enormous amount of pressure, unable to really enjoy being together as a couple in the daytime without someone analyzing us or bringing up painful subjects. That ended up bringing us down. We had plenty of nights alone, but a nice day alone was exactly what we needed. He never lifted his head from my shoulder, so I was assuming he was ready to go to sleep. And my assumption proved correct when I began humming, and he didn't protest. Edward seemed better when he woke up that morning. The crease in his forehead was gone, even though he was pretty much just laying in bed, with his eyes closed, running his fingers through his hair sleepily. I didn't have much time to ponder over the events of the previous night, so I jumped out of bed quickly, getting all my things together and dropping off his brown sugar burdens by the alarm clock. He was still in the bed looking sleepy, as he finally opened his eyes to meet my gaze. His eyes were red, and you could tell that he had been crying. But they were clear of any pain or burden as he smiled at me, sitting up when I climbed over to give him a kiss. He held my face sweetly in between his hands as he kissed me chastely, rubbing my cheeks and sighing against my lips. Neither one of us were really willing to deepen it, having neglected our dental hygiene the night before. I pulled away smiling, pleased that he was feeling better and wasn't upset with me for prying into his past. And he obviously wasn't, as he leaned back against the headboard with a smile as he gazed at me.
Gazebo at noon?
He asked in a sleepy voice as he ran his fingers through his hair. I smiled back widely, realizing he still wanted to go out, and nodded enthusiastically. He chuckled drowsily at my enthusiasm.
Pack a lunch,
he added as I stepped out the door. I left his room feeling relieved and hoping that maybe I had helped him a little bit by prying and forcing those wounds open a little. He had taken on so many of my burdens, it felt good to return the favor for once. As me had no issues with allowing me the day out with Edward. He had impressed her quite a bit the night before with all of his grand gestures. Alice was another story. Bella, she started as she looked at me frustrated in the center of my bedroom. What do you mean you don't know where you're going? She asked, exasperated. I shrugged and stared at her blankly, not really seeing the big deal. I didn't really care where we went, as long as I was with Edward. She huffed and threw down one of the shirts she had chosen. How the hell am I supposed to dress you? She screeched with raised eyebrows. I shrugged again, still staring at her blankly and still not seeing the big deal. And not really caring what I wore, as long as I wore it with Edward. Plus my veto was already used up. She let out the daintiest growl ever and began pillaging through the wardrobe, pursing her lips at things that were far too colorful for me to wear. I was very thankful I hadn't asked where we were going, because the mystery of the whole thing ruled out so many ridiculous items. She eventually forced me into the itchiest white gauzy shirt I had ever seen in my entire life. Its long flare sleeves hid my hands as they hung at my sides limply while I pursed my lips at myself in a mirror. It looked like it belonged on a baby doll. In fact, I think she called it a baby doll. It reminded me of maternity.